to basically create a new park. This is a nationally competitive program, and the director of the National Park Service is who selects these grants to award.
So I gotta ask, is there a definition of what urban is in this instance?
I believe that there is a definition. Actually, yes, there is a definition. It's based on population, and previously it was the project needed to be within a city of 50,000 people or more, and recently they've decreased that to 30,000. This program also has higher funding than we have in the state, and so grants from this program are much larger than what we could fund with our regular stateside program. So for instance, the maximum grant for this program is in the millions, and we just don't have that capacity to fund that type of project with the funding that we have. We were successful in receiving one of these grants back when the program first started. This was the Thomas Cully Park in Portland. And this was just a great project that did receive benefits from this program. And that's all I have. So if you have any questions or discussion, please feel free.
Thomas Cully one, the only one we received under that program.
Yes, and so in years past, NPS had a limit to how many applications could be submitted with the program. I believe the limit was 2. They've recently removed that barrier just because they would like to see more applications coming through, but we don't really receive lots of requests for this program. If an award is received, we do administer it, and we do the compliance, after the perpetual compliance, but it's nationally competitive, and yeah.
Does it have the same restrictions as the Land and Water Conservation Fund?
It does have the same restrictions.
That's a great challenge, Ms. Spice.
You said all the grants it's on a reimbursement basis?
Yes.
And do they bill you all or do they bill the feds?
So because it's a pass-through grant, they would bill us, and we would work with NPS to receive those funds and disperse them back to the sponsor. So
That's an administrative opportunity.
mhm.
Yeah, that's this program, as far as our grant programs, is kind of unique in like also our recreation trails program, where there's a lot more work involved. Whereas like with our local government grant program, they see you, we're entering into agreements and we're getting money out the door. Whereas after these CU, then we're just entering into our application process. And the same as us applying on behalf of our subrecipients, the same goes with our reimbursements, where basically they're submitting the required documentation to us. We make sure it's okay. And then Naomi prepares a package and sends it over to National Park Service. And then we get our little bit of indirect rate trickling in. So I do think the administrative grant that's coming will be really helpful. And we're just waiting to see what kind of requirements they're going to be or hoops we might have to jump through for that. But I do think it's pretty promising that it'll be slightly easier than the indirect rate process.
But those would also be reimbursable, probably the administrative grants.
Yes, and we did at that conference that Naomi talked about, many of the states brought up the fact that, like, please just give us the money and don't make us jump through a bunch of hoops. So that was heard. We'll see what happens with that. But I feel that way as well. What was explained to us is that with RTP, with our recreation trails program, we do just have a certain 7% administrative funds available. That's a block grant. This is not. And so that's why they're saying we have to do it in this way. But so we're hopeful that there won't be too many hurdles to jump through, or that's what we're hoping for.
That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions or?
Some of the other biggest challenges or opportunities that you see with the program especially that new one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So challenges and opportunities. I'll start with opportunities. And I was thinking about those today, actually, when we were out at Ecola, because that's a park that's already received land and water conservation funding. So it's encumbered already. So I'm getting more grants for that to maybe help with some of these infrastructure issues because it's a 50-50 grant. So if you're already putting funding into that, and you've already done planning and done the permitting and all the work that it's going to take to get to those things, it seems like this would be a really good opportunity. So the challenge is though, again, it's a federal program with a lot of regulations and different hoops we need to jump through. So it takes a little bit longer to get that funding out. And so it's hard to get into it too early. So like if you apply too early and you don't have all these things lined up, then as Naomi talked about earlier, there's a time limit ticking on that to once we obligate the funds to use them up. But yeah, I do think there's a real opportunity there for us to look at, not just for us, but the boundaries that Naomi was showing on the map of different parks throughout the state. Some of them received grants in like 1970, so they're probably ready for a rehab by now, like they've met their useful life. And so without adding additional boundaries throughout the state, I think we have a real opportunity to put more money out there in previously assisted sites.
Interesting. And so, yeah, it's not necessarily an allocation by state. It's just based on the number of applications that come in, or maybe I missed what the you get each year or each month.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about how the apportionments work for all the states?
Yeah, so the level of apportionment is based on population. It's a formula grant. And so they have, the feds have a special formula to let them figure out how much funding each state will get. And I think a majority is based on population, right?
Yeah, and we do have I might have mentioned this before, but we are in a unique situation in Oregon where we had, we wanted to get the money, we wanted to spread the love everywhere in the state, which was done in the form of like multiple little small grants everywhere, which we would not do that now. It's not really the best move because now you've got all these boundaries that we think that, it's really nice if we can get them back into the parks that we've been helping all this time.
So I have a question. You maybe answered it the way you were responding to the question about, but when you said if you have all the work done to get something, so in terms of the time frame when match can count, that's broader than just the you get the grant and then you have to invest the match. You can have invested some match upfront to.
A little bit,
Okay.
Yes. And that's kind of the case with most of our grant programs is that we do allow those pre-agreement costs. And with land and water, Naomi, is it 3 years prior to the project?
Okay.
Yeah. So we do. So if there was planning done, any design, things like that, that can be applied to the match. And then, yes, the match is applied during the project period, the rest of it.
It's possible to get those extended. It seems like projects are taking longer. It's really difficult this day and age to meet some of these, just to move these projects forward. So what's the opportunity to lobby for an extension on some of these?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, so with all of our I'll just speak about all of our grant programs. We have seen during the pandemic and then this time where there's supply chain issues, we have been a little bit more obviously understanding about those extensions and amendments. We have amended projects so that they can get done and completed successfully. So as an agency, we are always looking at being flexible while holding our project sponsors accountable for finishing those projects. We can program the money for a longer period of time, and we can say it's a 2-year project. We'll have a little wiggle room to extend. But then really the drop dead date is 5 years after we've obligated, correct? Yeah.
But you could move those funds to other projects if you need to.
Well, there's a couple ways we can do that. Yeah. So if we haven't used all of our annual apportionment, that will move to the next year and we'll add that on to that. The interesting thing, and I don't want to bore you too much, but tell me to stop if it's too much in the weeds. But with our indirect rate, that changes every year. And so when we award a grant and say the indirect rate is 20%, that only applies in that fiscal year. And so these projects are 2 to 3 years long. So if our indirect rate the following year is 12%, now we've obligated a larger grant, a larger amount of money to that project that we cannot now spend. So what we have is with National Park Service is called the special reapportionment account. So that happens when we close any grants. When we close any grants short, like if they get done under budget or there's still the indirect rate left over, that goes into a special reapportionment account. And the clock on that is very quickly ticking. I can't remember what the time limit is on that, Naomi, but it's way shorter than the 5 years. So we do have that opportunity right now. If we did lose money, it does go back to the federal government, but it kind of goes into the abyss. So we're talking about things like trying to, if we could give it to another state or just put it back in the program. We haven't lost money on this. I think prior to when, I think 2012, we might have lost 74,000 because the position wasn't fully staffed and we couldn't obligate all of our new money. So it's a very rare occasion that hasn't happened since then. But it is something to keep an eye on. And we're definitely looking for ways to always obligate all the money so that we don't lose any.
Do you think it's possible that a list could be put together, all the projects by county? I'd be curious just to look at, and
We have,
as I
yes.
drive around, I come across.
Yeah, and we also have the brand new interactive map that we have on our website. I think maybe Michelle might have showed it at the last meeting in September, but it's a map that's available to anyone in the public. The link is on our website and you can see all of the grants throughout Oregon with boundaries. You can click on it and get just some minimal information. So, but happy to provide that report to you.
Yeah.
It's easy with a computer.
So how,
So just to clarify that, it's easy if your grandkids are with.
sorry, I got a lot of questions, find it really interesting. And now I forgot my question. Oh, as it's a federal program with a lot of really hard board, guardrails and things like that, how much flexibility is there within the program to make changes or to be, more responsive or adaptive to the needs in the state? And part of that question too is what if anything should we as a commission know about this where we can influence or advocate, or is it just, hey, we're a pass through and we just run this program and the best we can do is get some better administrative cost coverage?
Do you want to talk about the SCORP and OPS thing?
Yeah, so one of the ways is through our statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan, which we update every 5 years, and we're currently in the process of updating that now. So with that, we provide a lot of opportunity for stakeholders or different committees or commissions to provide their input. And there's also surveys that go out to both public outdoor recreation providers and to users to really get the feel for what's needed out there and what the priorities are. And so the grants that we offer have to really meet the needs that have been identified there primarily, as well as needs that are identified through other means. If they have local planning documents that have identified needs that maybe are not necessarily identical to what's in the SCORP, but are really important to that community, those are opportunities. Anything else?
Yeah, and then so part of the SCORP is where we get our scoring criteria and also how we distribute the funds are within that SCORP. So that's the OPSP or Open Project Selection Process. And so that's where we kind of determine like, we right now, so if we open a funding cycle, 60% of the money is directed towards local communities and up to 40% is for state grants. There are some states that keep all 100% of the funding for their state projects. And sometimes, that might be something that we look at, maybe, maybe we have more state priorities one year. Right now it's an annual grant program where we do a 60-40 split, but those are areas where we could look at if we ever wanted to change that, or what the criteria is. So that's kind of in that way. And then, yeah, I guess as far as like if, being out there and how we can help the program, I think is just making, having awareness of what the program is. I think that we're doing trying to do a better job of those, grant recipients that don't know maybe that they received funding earlier on, and encouraging them to come and apply. So I guess, if people are talking about looking for funding out there for their local parks or even, for our state projects, I do think while it does have its, restrictions and complications, it does really, as you could see from the example projects, it does really great things. So I think just kind of talking about that and getting that information out there would be really helpful.
And so I would just add that Michelle and Naomi are being great job. It's really kind of fun to watch, right? Because this was Michelle forever, and Naomi, you've been with us like 2 years, and it's really cool to watch this transition. But I will say you guys have been very generous about this, but this is probably one of the biggest, hottest topics nationally right now. The Land and Water Conservation Fund program is severely struggling, and it is on pretty much every congressional member's minds right now because the money is not getting out the door in most of our states. And so I attribute a lot of it to their expertise and their willingness to continually go at the national park staff that are there that are probably more rigid than they need to be. And I only say that because I've said it directly to Joel and Elizabeth's faces.
Right.
And you can't say it, I can.
Yes.
So so Director Sams has actually taken 2 of the superintendents from National Park Service and put them on a special assignment to fix this, because there are many states that the money is not getting out the door. The administrative thing is great, but that's just one more complexity into something that was already broken. So it just creates more rules and more processes that now need to be developed, and they have to go through a code of federal regulations to be able to be codified. And it is not working well right now nationally. And when they talked about that Denver office opening, they're quadrupling the size of this program. And it's every year, it's by the end of the year, by the end of the year, by the end of the year. In some of these states, it's getting really political because that money has not gotten out of the door in that 5-year time period. And there's almost this belief that it's being done intentionally to put the money into the abyss so it can be used for other purposes politically. So as a commissioner, it's super important for you to know that, because although we're having our own weird little things with it, but nothing compared to what most of their peers across the country are dealing with. And not every state park system is the SLO. So that is somewhat unique too. So it's kind of hard to represent everybody because we're not all the same, right? But at the same time, it's significant for parks and local communities. So it's kind of a big deal. And then I think Director Sams also just brought on, I cannot think of his name right now, used to be Wyden's.
Yeah, neither.
McCurdy.
Yes, I
Help me, Liz, you know his name. And so literally all eyes and ears are on this program in this particular moment, because even the ORLAP program and RTP, they're getting out the door. They're having absolutely no problems, but this program is bottlenecked to all the way down to, what do you mean you want to use that type of gravel? What do you mean you can't put up an interpretive sign? What do you mean you want to do that? And it's like, have you ever been into a park?
Yes.
Could you go back in the slides to the process map?
Yeah.
Where in the process is the
It's
It's
the
the
back
bottom
to
button.
qualification and obligations of funds. So
when it goes back up to the feds?
when it goes back up to the feds, they're hanging there because it's basically like 2 to 6 staff that are really looking at these right now, and they need about 100.
So I can give an example. I mean, if we're gonna talk about these
I'm like, gosh, you really make
issues.
this sound good. I'm spending like
Ye-
6 hours a week. on this as
Yeah,
the
no, I
director.
mean, it definitely has its challenges, but I think that we're
lucky.
We're getting a little bit more traction, but yes, it could be better. And it ends up affecting our
Our
locals.
partners.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so like for state grants, it's only a few agencies, OPRD, ODF&W, state lands, and forestry,
Forestry.
Department of Forestry. Department of Forestry was coming to us quite often for grants, and we did, a few projects over in the Clatsop and Tillamook Forest, some campsites, some trails, water trail stuff. They came to us this last time. They got selected by the committee. The commission approved that project. We got to the part of the applications to NPS, and there was a very big debate about the LWCF boundary. They wanted to put the whole forest in the LWCF boundary. And so, I'm like, I get that you're in Omaha, Nebraska, but in Oregon, this forest is used for, it's a working forest. And so I do understand that they want to protect and make sure there's a certain recreational element in perpetuity. But that interpretation of how big the boundary could be can really, and that made it so that ODF just couldn't accept the fund. And so I don't know what they're doing with that project. That was what the Kings Mountain Trailhead
Yeah,
really much needed project. So that was really disappointing.
and it would have slid through probably 3 to 5 years ago.
3 to
Would
5
not
years
have
ago, no
been a
problem.
at
We were
all.
giving ODF similar project grants up
And-
until that
And
point.
it's folks that haven't been in the region, so it's creating this problem of, and it gets to the point you were talking about earlier is that, so the city of Salem is probably the best example that I can point to because everybody has probably been to the waterfront, right? So that's an LWCF land purchase where the riverfront is in Salem, where the carousel is. And so, you fast forward 30 years and a new city manager and mayor are like, hey, I want to put in a coffee shop down there. I want to put a bistro. And we're the bad guys that have to say no. And they're like, well, we're going to do it anyway. And it's like, well, you can't do it. It's a perpetuity, right? So we've got to be really clear about those boundaries because there are huge implications to a community that if you do that, and that's why you hear Cammy all the time saying, and I can't see all the way back there, but I mean, you hear our property people all the time saying, now we're gonna figure out how to do a conversion, and that conversion is us because we are the Land and Water Conservation Program.
Mhm.
Where in other places that may or may not be true. So we're looking at our property all the time, trying to figure out how do we reconcile this so we can make a community happy, but we've got to now convert something in our property holdings. And that inventory is very minimal any longer because we have done it mostly for the community. So we've taken a harder line to say, community, this is your problem. If you want to do something different, you're going to have to figure out where you put that new boundary or that conversion or whatever those technical pieces look like. So I
Yep.
appreciate how kind you're being about it, but I
Yes,
also want to advocate for you that it's not been golden lately.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Lisa, so that, yes, if there's any other questions or, concerns or how else that might be affecting us, we can speak to that too. But thank you for opening up the conversation.
So it's really interesting hearing this conversation and the political implications are huge from local government about this fund, not these grants, this fund. It's hugely political. So, the impacts that they can and do have on communities. So there's all kinds of issues, but the 2 questions, is there a general amount of money that's expected annually? And I just spaced the other one, so answer that one, maybe we'll come back to me.
So on average, recently, our apportionments, as we saw on that chart, they've increased, but we're averaging around 4 million per fiscal year.
So can and does occasionally a federal agency apply for state funding on a project?
No.
Can't be done.
Yeah, no, the Land and Water Conservation Fund is split into the 2 programs, the federal and the state side. So the federal side is to acquire land, and it's available for agencies like BLM, Fish and Wildlife, US Forest Service.
Nicely done. Thank you.
Just one question, if I may. Do I understand correctly? I have this vague recall, and excuse me, because I've been on pharmaceuticals for the last 60 days. But there's been a push to fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund from states and recreation partners in recent years. Has that been successful? I seem to recall that happened, but now all those funds are tied up. Is that what I'm hearing?
We're like, yeah, we finally got it.
Yes.
We can't spend it.
Yep, that's exactly correct. Yes, we did get fully funded,
Funded.
but like if you can't
Spend
access.
it, it doesn't matter.
That's the real problem is then
Yeah.
the jumping through the hoops and making sure everything is done. But yeah, so it's good news.
Well,
Hence, that's where the
yeah.
folks feel like maybe there's a cause behind the delays because maybe some weren't happy that, and it's all conspiracy theory crazy, but it's, I mean, I hate to think that it could be true, but it was about the same time and we had a global pandemic and
Yeah.
now in a lot of this, if you add in the, the Buy America and trying to find
Yeah.
parts and I mean, it's very, I mean, just trying to figure out how do you need to buy a chainsaw, but you can't get
Yeah.
the steel built and the entirety has to be built in America and that doesn't exist, right? So it's got opportunities.
Yes, as we're talking, I'm thinking, in my little sliver of National Park Service grant writing world, there's often an advantage. I hate to put it this way. I'm glad we're not like the press isn't here. There's sometimes an advantage in the disarray of the National Park Service, in that talented state staff, for example, can step in and kind of understand the process, at least as well as some of the other people who are rotating through those positions on the federal side. So in a way, while I understand that this has been difficult because the federal hoops have to be jumped through and the hoops are in motion, like literally they're moving from state to state. Do you see advantages that somehow we can still realize by what's going on right now, this point of transition? Is there any silver lining to this in terms of the disarray we've seen on the federal side that allows us to get more done for the state of Florida? And if there isn't a good answer to that, that's okay. I just
I
wanted to kind
mean,
of.
the best answer is we have gotten their attention. I mean, so with NSORLO and so the National Association of State Liaison Officers and the National Association of State Park Directors, we've actually hired a lobby firm and we actually have somebody on the Hill working on it. So that is probably the best way because no matter how incredible they are, once you get back to that review and approval, if it hangs up.
Because a bottleneck is a bottleneck.
Bottleneck is a bottleneck. And so the best part was talking about it nationally and recognizing that everybody who was having some similar issues, it was the same spot. And then it was like, so it's really obvious now, like we've diagnosed the problem. Now we need to figure out, there's no more symptoms, right? Like this is where we need to go. And
Understood.
understood. And they're doing everything they can. It seems like we have their attention.
Mhm.
You actually got the training and you actually had them in the
Yes.
room. That wasn't happening for 3 years. I mean, the attention is there.
Right.
And there's a big commitment from the top to try to get this figured out because every other, well, at least the programs we are interacting with, the other grant programs are functioning different than this one is. So there's something going on
Something
here.
Yeah.
Because you always have that thing, right? Where you might have somebody, because I keep going, well, it's shit, but what if we just say, hey, we're doing this for you? Like, what if we stop doing it?
Yeah.
You'd have to do it yourself. So
Yeah, I will say that I do feel the most hopeful knowing that they are hiring the staff they've recognized. I think that there's like a period of time where it's like they weren't really
they weren't
recognizing it.
listening.
Yes. And so I do feel hopeful that it does take a good two
To
and
get
a
them
half
done.
years to learn the program. And so they're hiring a lot of folks there that need to, kind of have some experience. So I think by like 2025, we might see some big
Which is hard.
changes. I know that isn't, it's better than though, like,
Yeah.
there's no hope.
But a
So-
bunch of us were saying, well, what if we let Naomi and Michelle, because you can work from anywhere, what if we put them on loan to you? Like, how can we transition
Yeah.
you through this
Right,
rough
yeah.
patch?
Mhm.
And there was not a lot of listening, but there's much more listening now.
Yeah.
I have to say, when we were at the NSORLO conference, they were talking about these positions available, and I felt like maybe they were looking a little bit too hard at Naomi when they were saying that. And I was like, "You
No.
can have her."
Like, figure your things out first, and then we'll talk.
Yes, I'm always supportive of advancement, but
Chrissy, I saw your hand. Did you?
Yeah, I just wanted to take this sort of just in time training, in fact, the Historic Preservation Fund, which funds 60% of the strip owner's work, is, comes from the same revenue source that LWCF. And just to sort of side by side, we get 4 million about roughly, and that is a now permanently not just funded at the top level, but permanently authorized. Whereas in the past, both HPF and LWCF, we have to go back, congressionally every year and cross our fingers and hope it gets reauthorized. The Historic Preservation Fund is not permanently authorized yet.
We are.
And it is nowhere close to being fully funded. It's to be about $1 million every 2 years for that program to run the Oregon ship. And that portion is based on population, number of historic properties, over 50 years old, and a couple of other funky math equations I don't understand very well. So just to sort of, put it side by side, LWCF, HPF is hoping to get where LWCF is now in terms of authorization and
Permanency.
But as it is, I think next year or the year after, HPF is gonna be up for grabs.
Again.
So.
Except your grants are moving out the door quicker.
Yeah.
Be wise.
Ship out.
Forever to pay you.
Yeah.
50 years from now.
Ours is actually not a grant, it's operational funding for all the state historic preservation offices in the states and territories, 59 offices. So it's processed as a grant, it's treated like a grant, but it's actually not a grant. And yeah, they have a whole different staff administering it, and it's got budgets, but not like nobody's. It doesn't have the same program requirements, obviously.
Nicely
All
done. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Oh, that was great.
It'll make way more sense now when we talk about property and things we own and things we're doing and boundaries.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
So we should be back at the hotel for 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I saw before, but I wasn't sure if this.
I'll be back for him.
No, exactly.
Thank you.
Now you're doing it. If you need anything.
South Beach, South Beach.
That's right, as long as you got time to get in, good, all is well, you can have slides.
That's not good. I don't see anything.
Okay, yeah.
We're going to be in all this stuff.
Yeah, it's inflammatory and everything.
Nothing too.
Exactly where we can.
No.
Okay.
We weren't sure what.
Dinner's at 6. We were gonna try to be back at the hotel by 4, but I don't want to curb this conversation because the most important thing is where is. Oh.
So you like. That's. And they're under since. That's.
I would be.
So it's like.
We could even get you a car if you need to go back.
No, we're good. We're good.
Okay.
We just didn't know what the time.
For what? Oh, yeah, no, I need to jump on a work call at 3. And then, was trying to catch someone at 4:30, so we're already started, I think we're back at that cell at 4:15.
Yeah.
We'll be
Say
We'll try to
bye.
get fast.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm ready to go. Liz,
We're ready?
stay on? Is Liz Hill still
All
there?
right, team.
Still
We're
here.
going to
Okay,
kick off the real estate services portion of our work session.
Thanks so much for having us this afternoon. We wanted to re-engage the conversation around acquisition. And then I was told I had to get really close to that, but it's quite loud. Up a little bit.
Doug's.
Of this conversation today, and then hopefully just stir up some good discussion. So over to Tabitha to get us going.
Just say, I think many of you have met me before, at least the meetings over the computer. My name is Tabitha Henriksen, one of your real estate services staff. But today, my piece, we're going to talk about a little bit of just recent past that we used for sort of making some of our decisions. So, nope, hold on. All right. All right. So your authority, we're going to look at ORS and OAR. This is going to be sort of the quick flash over, but ORS 391 addresses. Oh. Through agreements, permitting those pieces for our property management. 390 requirements for establishing priorities for positions. So we're required to come up with some, but it does encourage public are for the agency. What is something, and then addresses facilities near urban population centers. There is some additional ORS, and we're familiar. The Ocean Shores program, those pieces has an element that the department can acquire land
So the department does have the ability to acquire and
maintain what we currently own.
Right.
And it needs to have some criteria around that to say, is it performing in a park that already, we've got to start thinking about where we can expand. The thing we were talking about today at Fort Stevens, it's not an acquire another large park somewhere else and spend millions and millions of dollars. Let's add where we already know we have access and we have the staff and the resources to manage and maintain it. And we also need to look at, in that park system plan, nobody liked talking about those quadrants, especially if you were a park manager, right? You didn't want to hear yours was an underperforming. Parks aren't here to make money, right? And we've got to start having that dialogue. And so talking about disposition and talking about that plan and in a different lens rather than the SCORP and the recreation needs are great. And
Right.
we also have to figure out how do we manage and maintain for the long haul. So yes, your memory is exactly right, because you were sitting there, because that's about the time I ended up in your office.
Right. Yep.
Going back a bit to the previous slides, so for the statutes 390 dot blah 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 and the admin rules. When were those established and when was the last time that they've been updated, if at all?
It's a good question. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I can figure that out for you.
A long
Yeah.
time.
That's a good question.
Can we phone a legal friend?
Gypsy.
Yeah, no, the authority to acquire lands and things like that would have been at the time we were split off from ODOT.
So
Because of this is our organic statute that establishes the department and the authority of the commission and stuff like that. You can't alienate the ocean shore, that pre-existed the
was
establishment
in
department.
ODOT.
That's part of the beach bill. So it comes back to 69. So various states, but no recent changes to the commission's authority for acquisition or direction. That said, probably around 2000, there was the amendment that said you shall prioritize acquisitions. And oh, by the way, your priorities should include Thompson's Mill and.
That was a park management program. That was in
No,
2007.
but it's in statute.
Oh, that's right. It is.
It is.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but.
I'm just wondering if we're starting to continue to have this conversation that's evolved in my time here. And if we're referencing some of the foundational statutes and rules, is there an opportunity to go back and revisit them? Because maybe there's something that shifted, like climate resilience and understanding like our, I don't know, various things, like when it comes to equity and inclusion and those different things. And so, yeah, was just wondering if they've been on a cycle for review for some of the foundational bedrock pieces, but knowing that it's kind of a whole piecemeal of other things is good context. Yeah, because if there's things at the, again, bedrock that we maybe want to revisit, maybe
Right.
it's a time there.
And one of my
Yes,
other
Tammy
teammates
has
is gonna
it.
speak some.
I'm thinking about the criteria and again, my recollection, some of it comes from statute, some of it is rule. And then the rest of it is pretty much
Policy.
at your
Yeah.
discretion and
Mhm.
policy.
And I think even with your discretion within the rules, we could get to some of those things. I would caution us to think about large concepts.
Oh, I'm not excited to like go and open up the books and go through a process, just.
I think it's
understand-
generic enough that I think we
Yeah,
could.
because if we're running into issues or something now based on something that we have to go back and look at, or that it's not allowing us to adapt, then there's a chance. But if we can handle it through department policy, great, always easier.
Or even just policy direction from you, I think would get us mostly there.
So you want the six of us to tell you to go
Uh-huh.
open 6 parks in 6
No,
months?
no.
Yeah. 6 parks in 6
Lofty goals.
It could be, what's the small park in Portland? It's the little city park.
I have a question. I think it was one of the previous slides. You don't need to go back, but it said the draft park system plan in 2013. So do we
Yes.
have a park system plan?
We do.
Have I seen it?
No,
Probably not.
it was created mostly by one and it wasn't ever really adopted by the public and or the agency. And so it's there and it has some great information, but it was never fully vetted or finalized.
Would it be helpful to have one?
Well,
see
I
pros
think,
and
I mean,
cons.
it certainly wouldn't hurt for you to look at it as long as we're not taking it as it's our guide. I mean, there's, yeah, there's
Yeah.
definitely great information and we refer back to it, especially.
We do
when we get to
reference
this
it, because there
often.
is some pretty good information
Great
there.
data.
I think probably, and this is me being candid, I think probably the biggest issue with it was the author,
Yeah.
you know.
It about ruined our organization.
All right, then, that's over here, I think.
Yeah. We can talk about that tonight.
So I got a comment. I've been for a couple of weeks trying to figure out when and if this was an appropriate conversation for this commission meeting. And since this is a work session and since we're talking about acquisitions, maybe it is. So I'm really struggling as a commissioner with, we're only going to focus on existing. When I look at the change since COVID in camping and outdoor recreation, and then I look at every economic plan that's written for Eastern Oregon and probably the rest of the state, every one of them ties back to tourism and recreation, without a doubt, completely, totally. And if this agency isn't going to look at opportunities that are hugely growing in Eastern Oregon, I'm lost. And I guess I'd like some clarification. Where are we going? And there's gigantic opportunity out there.
There's gigantic opportunity across the state. So no one has said we're only doing existing. That's the whole point of this conversation, and these work sessions have been to get. So that's from 2013. We're in 2022, and we're trying to get that policy direction now together with you to say, what do you want us to do now? Like we're out of this. We're coming out of this cycle. What is the policy direction for the next 10 years from this commission? And in particular, before you and you and you and you and you go off. I mean, you guys, your time is coming up, and it takes you a good 4 years to really understand how this works and what it means. And I keep telling Vicky, she's like, I'm ready to go. And I'm like, not till you guys get this policy piece done on where we're heading with our acquisition strategy, because you guys now get it. And we need your policy input on where we're heading. It's not that's where we were, because we had just come out of a park a year program with a whole bunch of parks that we didn't pick.
Right. And this was based on what they were looking at for the economic forecast, right? As we knew it was not reasonable to continue to expect to develop new parks every year. We just didn't have the money for that. So we were going to focus on acquisitions that had to do with existing parks, where they're in holdings, where there are access issues, where do we need some buffer around an existing park. Those were that was sort of our focus and our direction at the time. That particular time period, we talked about creating new parks only if they were economically feasible, if we could leverage some sort of grants or donations, because we knew we didn't have much for acquisition dollars necessarily to work with, or something that would create an opportunity for a new form of revenue generation, something that was, maybe didn't already exist in the system or could duplicate one of our, most popular experiences. But with this, back to this idea of not adding additional staff, and that's a tough balance to tell staff that they may be spread, additionally thin. So, and I think I spoke a little bit to some of this sort of creative partnership and looking at donations and what sorts of revenue sources are available out there. So that was the push for 2013. So like Lisa is saying, we're going to kind of talk through some history sort of pieces before we get to sort of the ask and the thought process of where do we want to be now,
to help you understand like where we've been, to be able to know where do we want to go, because you all have one of these lovely new history books. They're signed by the 4 living directors from the history while we were all together. So we were all together and had these signed for you, but you'll kind of go through, and they're going to talk about each one of those time periods, how this has kind of ebb and flowed, and you'll realize that we're back at a point in history that we have been once before. And so there's lots to learn from it, but at the same time, it's right back to kind of where we
ebb and flow. Exactly.
So we expect you to read these tonight, so you're ready for the test tomorrow. And there's no audible version.
Well, and I was going to say, I'm going to turn it over to JR next. But I'm hopeful that this helps kind of pique some some interest and some thoughts for you, understanding kind of what were our recent decisions, what were our recent pushes for direction, and then where are we headed now?
Liz, are you okay hearing better now or no?
Yeah, I can hear now. But
Okay,
it's been out
awesome.
for a good 15 minutes, so I'm.
Ah. We'll send you the clip notes.
Thanks.
I think that's one on this thing. Sorry, just give me a sec and we'll get it queued up.
Exactly. Look out.
Did you get signed one?
This one's signed.
This one's time.
I gotta have three.
So kind of to the point of just what we were talking about, and in reference to your newly acquired history books. Yeah, thanks, Steve. Then I
It might not be.
Sharing screen. Yeah, it's going to help you.
Thanks.
See, it's all the stuff that we didn't know Chris just did.
Yeah, no, it'll be different each time. There's a- Okay. So
This is part of JR's other presentation from lunch that day.
that, yes, sure, that's the template.
This before.
Yeah, no, a little alteration. This is property centric. So in line with your newly acquired history books, and kind of to the spirit of what Lisa's saying and Tabitha and what we're all, the theme you're going to hear from all of us is setting context of where we're at, how we've been making decisions, and then looking for guidance of we're actually at a knock on wood at a spot where we can make those adjustments. And so but it's not always been the case in our past. So as you're all aware, we're in our 100th year. If we back up even 1 year further, 1921 was the first convention of state parks, brought together by the first National Park Service Director, Stephen Mather, where he called all the states together, or at least for representatives from every state, to talk about state parks as a movement and creating a system of state parks across the country. That prompted a lot of states to get active in acquiring property. In Oregon, that fell to the Highway Commission, and they were granted authority to start acquiring property within 300 feet of public roads. And so that was our initial kind of acquisitions, waysides. Cars were coming online. People needed places to rest their cars, add water, and all that. So our first park superintendent of note that we're going to talk today about is Samuel Boardman. He came on as park superintendent in 1929, hired as a park engineer. That kind of morphed into being superintendent / director. That he was the lone parks employee at the time, and an emphasis on preserving and purchasing land for beautification and still kind of that wayside philosophy. And per Boardman, he was given a lot of autonomy. Amenities were very simple. He was a purist, a conservationist before it was probably a term. He actually didn't really want people on the parks. He just wanted to preserve the landscapes and that they were beautiful. And so they didn't have much. They were park properties. That tenure of Boardman's over 21 years as park superintendent, that grew our system when he had started in 1929, a little over 6,000 acres to over 57,000 acres in his time as park superintendent. So his job was to acquire land.
Was this mostly through eminent domain?
It was a combination. There was some purchases, a lot of donations. Over 100 properties were accepted as donations in lieu of being named after the donor. So a variety of sources.
Sarah Helm, like what?
Yeah.
It was all during the Great Depression, so there were a lot of people motivated.
And man, he'd come to your kitchen table and you couldn't tell him no.
What happened to the 300 feet?
That was an authority that they kept, just that they could acquire within. They still had to buy or beg, borrow, or steal any of that to get it. But at that time, that was as far as they could go. It had to just be. So at some point that changed in statutes.
So you didn't do that research. It just, we know it changed at some point.
At some point, yeah, where they started buying true just park property that wasn't tied necessarily to the state highways, because it was actually relegated to the state highways at the time. Going to Commissioner Berger's comment about how he got it, and so Cap Collier, who donated Collier Memorial State Park, he was a longtime Parks Commissioner and worked with the agency for years. He called Mr. Boardman a magnificent beggar. He was good at talking people out of property. And so as you can see, 57,000 acres, 51,000 of it acquired during his tenure. Again, and that resulted in over 151 park properties, new park properties. The problem was, and I don't know if it's a problem per se, but like, this thing's crazy.
It's frozen.
Yeah, he didn't have a computer.
Yeah.
That's it.
Hold on, I'm having a
And
technical
that's the end of the
glitch.
story.
Wasn't in the 1950s.
That would be how many parks?
Oh, my gosh. No one makes
Well, they're fussing with that. The reason for my question is that when I was having some fun with Chris and that.
Oh, yes, the trivia.
The
Yes,
trivia
yep.
thing on those parks, I'm going through your website. And huge numbers say they were acquired through
By
litigation. And I said to Chris, what does that mean? It
Condemnation.
means condemnation during, and no doubt during this period.
It's part of the highway program.
Yeah, if you go to the website, they'll give the
Yeah.
history of the parks that are there. And when they were acquired and how they were acquired, and I said litigation is not a nice word. They ought to change that to acquired through the highway department or
Department.
something like that,
Right.
rather than litigation, because that sounds like, well, we sued for
And we won.
it. I didn't like the tone of that.
Was there a lot of condemnation? Of course.
I don't know that it was condemnation, but you'd be talking about right of ways through scenic corridors. So, I mean, in some of them, you're gonna see when you look at the list or the actual map of the park property, some of them, it's like, why do we have that? Do you even know we have that? You're gonna find something you didn't even know we had.
Because it was part of the highway.
They were part of the highway or part of the scenic corridor. That's no longer scenic.
Sometimes property owners would like that because it gives them the best deal.
Right.
They can't sell their property,
Yeah.
it's worthless. So if the state
If you give
acquires
a
it through
donation
eminent
or-
domain, they have to give you a certain price.
And it's this anecdotal observation, but going through a lot of deeds over managing a lot of our park properties, a lot of I wouldn't say a majority, but there's a lot of deeds that is how they were acquired, but it doesn't reference whether it was
Eminent
contentious or whether it was disputed. It just said that they were declared that they were gonna take it and decide for park purposes.
But
But
it
how?
says litigation on our website, that's what I.
Yeah, and I mean. There could have been agreement as to the acquisition and then just litigation over the price.
Our website should say something else.
I have to say, I mean, I've spent a lot of time. I've spent a lot of time reading Boardman's correspondence and a lot of it, I mean, boxes and boxes of his correspondence, and I don't see that much evidence or that much extremely contentious litigation. But part of what's going on is that, like, during the Great Depression, you have, for example, like the Halem Bay State Park is a great example. That was platted out into 50 by 100 lots that were being sold sight unseen to people right before the Great Depression. And then suddenly they acquire big portions of that park, but there are all these little tiny infills in what was at that time blowing Doomfield. And so the legal action is required to just sort of stitch the quilt back together.
Oh, there it is.
Often
There's, that gave me a
involved,
little
it's not
webinar.
eminent domain kinds of litigation, but litigation in terms of literally finding individuals and tracking them.
Totally get that.
like the word litigation. And I agree. I feel like, I guess I'm thinking we should actually be more true to the realities of those, when we try to describe it to the public.
Through legal proceedings.
Legal proceedings, I don't know, because.
Doesn't sound better.
You don't see this, you don't see what we think of as kind of the classic model.
Property
of eminent
acquisition.
domain.
Well,
Space.
but the word acquired during the era of the Department of Transportation Management, you know.
It's not like that.
I agree.
You know, if you don't like the word litigation, you're gonna hate executive session tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah, I want to sit that one out.
I know it's your bread and
So-
butter. It's just, I don't like it on our website.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's where I don't like it.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
get it.
And I guess my point is it should be characterized differently, because when you really read some of those records, it isn't what you think of when you hear that.
Exactly.
That's not what it really is.
Oh, maybe we don't even have to say that. Maybe they're to say they're acquired during that time. Leave it alone.
It was anarchic. A lot of Boardman's correspondence is like trying to find the people.
Don't put
who own
anarchic in.
that lot, and it's like. It's just.
If it's a happy story acquired by donation of the family of yada,
Yeah, and
put it in there.
Boardman-
Acquired this year.
Boardman himself, part of Boardman's skill was that he actually was a failed homesteader in his own right. Boardman, Oregon, his name. And he had a farm there that more or less went belly up. And so then he got involved with tree planting along the highways to make little shady spots in eastern Oregon as kind of a fallback, because he wasn't making money on the farm. But he could kind of speak to people who were also in hard times financially and had lands they wanted to own and things like that. So it's not really comparison really, but there was a lot of just
That's really interesting.
active conversation about, okay, your farm's going under, let's talk. I just went through that. So I think Boardman had a lot of that in his background. And it kind of,
He was the most lively superintendent.
he was lively. He said stuff in his correspondence.
Oh my God, the one tractor story from Detroit, it
Yeah.
comes up annually in the
Yeah, yeah.
and they just share it.
Don't
Oh,
make paper trail.
man, he can write though.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
it's still
yeah.
trying to talk.
Still have time. It can be posted.
Yeah, yeah.
I could never.
Still working
So-
on it.
Yeah.
All right,
So-
so you want to skip that?
Yeah, well, yeah, so short version of that, and it was gonna talk a bit about all that acquisition, 57,000 acres and 151 park properties. There was no facilities, we own no campgrounds at that point. And so for all that, he didn't believe in development. He wanted it natural. And so at the end of Boardman's tenure, up until 1949, we didn't have any campgrounds because that's not what he believed in. So he acquired land. That was his charge. That's what he did, was got land. So when Chester Armstrong came in 1950, he was then given the guidance from above as director. So go build your park system. We don't need to worry about acquiring. Worry about building. And they, whether it's politeness or not, they were waiting for Boardman to leave. And so within 2 years, 1952, we opened our first two campgrounds, one at Silver Falls and one at Wallowa Lake. And that was the beginning of overnight facilities for Oregon State Parks. That was Chester Armstrong's legacy, is building the park system. In that 10 years, we built 44 campgrounds. So we went from that net 0 to 44, which is the core of our system still today, was built in that 10-year period. After Armstrong left, it switched over to Dave Talbot. Dave Talbot was our long tenure director of almost 29 years, almost 30 years. And we're going to see how good I just talk off my memory of it, which will be good. His tenure from a property and management aspect was centered more around programs. So first it was get the property, then it was build the property. Third, it was build the system. And so his tenure is marked on building programs. SHPO came in under Dave Talbot's tenure, Willamette River Greenway, the Oregon Scenic Waterways, Federal Scenic Waterways program, all those programs. So our agency building, thanks Doug, building, I'll catch us up here.
Nicely done.
Yeah.
So here's where we're at. Building all these programs, that's when the beach bill came back, is in 1966. SCORP, the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. All these things came in, and those came with property obligations at times that were driving. So while there was probably other acquisitions in he was director for 29 years, there was other acquisitions. Those weren't the focus. The focuses were generally around this. And this is how we acquired 100 Greenway properties that we have. And to that, and some of them, the properties on scenic waterways that were taken in eminent domain, like the piece I referenced on the John Day River, I think that's the only one that we did an eminent domain taking on. Yeah. So Dave, as he went through that process as director, and I remember how many years ago was it, Lisa, that you had him come talk at our managers meeting, and it was like super cool. And these guys can all kick in thoughts on this, but to hear firsthand from Dave, Director Talbot, talk about, he was Chester Armstrong's assistant when he first started and called him Chet, and so he's talking about each of these programs and what the pressure was that they were getting, of where they were putting resources and time. And he referenced all these programs, like, this is what we were getting pressured to do. Like the city of Newport, I remember at the time, because I was on the coast in Newport, and he was like, the city of Newport called and was like, hey, so we're going to tear down this lighthouse. Do you guys want this? Which is Yaquina Bay Lighthouse. And so he said, so we drove over there and took a look at it and went, yeah, we could probably do a park here. And just that was kind of that era of time that was his driver. The downside of that is towards the end of his tenure, or certainly the second half of his tenure, the funding was kind of going away. We were not our own agency. We were a portion of ODOT, or in the highway department. Gas tax was taken away. Measure 5 took away additional taxes. So Parks was kind of a subsidiary, and so it wasn't necessarily fully funded. So things started to pull back. We started to make budget cuts and reduction in service. That continued through the end of Dave's tenure. In 1990, when we split off as our own agency, ODOT split Parks off to become their own agency. We had an estimated $100 million in backlog maintenance. Dave retired in 1992, and Director Bob Minan took over at a pretty rough time. Those budget issues continued and got worse and worse until 1996. Director Minan went in front of the legislature with the proposal to close 66 parks, lay off some staff, saying that we were at that tipping point, that we couldn't maintain our system any further. As was referenced by Commissioner Berger earlier, then with the onset in 1998 of Measure 66, and then in 2010 when Measure 76 made funding permanent, dedicating lottery funds to state parks, that kind of turned around. And then it's like that kind of gave us permanent funding that really just solved everything, right?
So you don't need us.
Consequently, in that same time period, yeah, it's so simple. In that same time period, we were gifted a new program and an idea.
Go back one.
Yes, sir.
What's the banner at the bottom?
That was a bumper sticker. It wasn't a banner. They were handing out the bumper stickers, and you see them around. Some folks still have copies of them sitting in their office.
Is it a wonderful irony that he was going to close 66 parks and it's measured 66?
Well, so,
Yeah.
and the really sad part is these are signed by the 4 of us that are still living out of the 9 directors in our history. But we tried to do that pre-COVID, and we had reached out to Bob, and Bob's memory had pretty much escaped him at that point. And
They were gonna get together in April of 2020.
yeah, we were gonna have the director's evening, and he had pretty much degraded at that point. But his wife said, and Teresa said multiple times in the conversations we've had over the last 3 years, and she said, the greatest gift that Bob ever had was Oregon, and the greatest gift that you all got was Bob. in Oregon doing this for you because he said he was driven out of Oregon, like he had to leave, like there was no way politically or personally he could sustain, but he did what the system needed by getting that lottery funding dedicated. But at the second that it happened, the dedicated lottery funding happened with the commitment that the general fund would stay with the agency. The lottery fund came in, the general fund went away. So basically it reversed everything that he had worked so hard personally and professionally for. And so that was a pretty pivotal moment that I don't think we pause often enough to recognize that, because everybody's like, you have this constitutionally dedicated lottery. You're like, yes, and it doesn't, we're not really any different than we were before. It's nice, but it's, especially when other people decide how we're gonna spend it versus whatnot, but. so
Being
I'll-
permanently funded is a home run, right?
The permanent funding is definitely helpful. It just doesn't, it's not the only way, and it will not fund the system and sustain us over time. It's not enough.
Yeah, it's only permanent voters don't create another measure too, right?
Right.
Yeah. Not putting that out there.
Yeah.
Interesting side note that I'm sure is coincidental, and I don't know that I've ever personally verified it, but I read on this was when this list of layoff parks was pretty equitable against all our congressional districts in the state. That there was actually a pretty equitable split of the number of parks that were going to be closed in each congressional district across the state.
You don't think that's coincidental?
Yeah, no. No, I don't. So bring us up as we started talking about a few minutes ago, the Park a Year program. Then that was a driver that came in that again, we had some input on, but kind of limited input on, hey, here's some money, but here's some acquisitions. And it focused on generally new properties and building. We opened our first new campground in over 30 years, which is a big statement again. So if you talk about what our strategies are or priorities, until Stubbs Stewart opened in 2007, we had not opened a new campground. And so we had been in a long period of not developing new parks, at least in that sense of the word. That brings us up to today.
There's my point.
So now that's going to kind of that historical context of where we're at and what those different eras of different directors had as far as what they were being encouraged of where focus should be. So bringing us up to now and kind of where our focus is. And I have one more document to share, and then I'll kind of turn it over to Matt to kind of bring us up to speed on kind of current status. Flies are waking up.
And since the heat's off, it's freezing in here. No. That's fine.
Is that space
Yeah.
you're working on this?
I'm just wearing a jacket.
Do you want this one, Vicky?
No.
You sure?
Yeah. That won't help my feet.
Yeah.
What about your feet?
That won't help my feet.
Jonathan's like, I'm gonna go find a tank top.
My feet are.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I compose them? Yeah, so required. There.
It's still on.
There it did it.
Here's Liz.
Perfect. Incremental on that.
Right.
So now it's just bring this up a little closer to where we're at and some of the factors that we are talking about as far as how we go about our property management or prioritization, even to Steve's comment about, are we just adding on or are we looking at new? And so some of the things we look at is and there's three factors that we have broken this down to when we started to build this as a workshop. And one of them had to do with some of the factors of how we manage existing properties as far as and you can see it on the screen, increasing capacity, rationing the use or permit systems, how we protect experience or balance the natural, cultural, scenic resources, and how we choose to accommodate or take the feedback from local governments or partners. And that simply is done through our comprehensive process, our comprehensive master planning process right now. If it's a minor thing, we don't need to go through a master planning process, but for our major properties, that's defined. That master planning process does every one of these things. That's why it has public meetings and stakeholder groups and local landowner groups. And so that's right now how we do it. And we can't veer too far off of that without re-triggering going through a new comprehensive plan. The trick of that system is that applies to properties we already own. We don't pre-plan if we haven't acquired, but so it's really, this is just for existing park properties. As far as the next comment is kind of what our role is around outdoor recreation in Oregon and what role we play in that. I would say we debate that constantly about what our role is. And so our role is how I laid it out here is we have a role that I think is a sliding scale. And so on one end, we have where we're just in a very kind of a distant supporting role, which is financial. This is our grants program, as Michelle and Naomi were talking about earlier, where we support non-OPRD properties through financial services or and through a program we administer, whether it's a grant from us or it's a pass-through grant that we administer. Next would be when we offer technical assistance, such as planning or professional level support to local government projects. A recent example that I could think of was at Cape Kiwanda down in Tillamook County. We offered to do some of the planning and scoping for them to solve what we considered was a problem we had interest in, because we also were right there on the ocean shores and have Cape Kiwanda natural area. And so we provided that technical expertise because they don't have that on staff. The next part of that is as far as interaction is facilitation, adding staff level to support to help move projects forward as requested by a local government or group, or again, that we have a vested interest in. Most recent example of that is the East Moraine acquisition near Wallowa Lake in Northeast Oregon. That was a project we've been affiliated with for probably a decade before acquisition, helping with scoping, planning, helping convene and convene the group and the team, facilitate that team. I think we're currently managing that group as far as we chair that team, even though we're not the property owner, just to help them through creating a recreation plan and a maintenance strategy for that property. The next level of that would be leadership of statewide significant recreation assets or needs. I have OCT, the Oregon Coast Trail, listed on there, and so that's one right now that is another current example where we've been facilitating a local landowner group and stakeholder group on how do we close gaps, how do we manage the Oregon Coast Trail, and how do we start to implement strategies and goals. And finally, then expanding as the most engaged we would be is expanding our own recreation access or portfolio. And that's when we say, okay, this actually should be a state park, and that's the criteria that oftentimes properties, and East Moraine is a great example of that, is right from the get-go, we were like, this is not a state park. We don't want it to be a state park. That's not what our mission is, but we do see it's significant and important, and we will partner, but we don't want to own it. And versus some of these, we do get to that point where it's like, okay, this is actually a significant property that belongs in the state park system. So that's kind of how we would see our role currently. This is our current discussion on the exec team. And then finally going into kind of some of the acquisition and development considerations before we get to our main strategy right now. And those considerations we broke down into, and I described it as bubble diagram, but kind of three main factors. And we call it, and that you kind of start from one and go to the second one and go to the third, but that it's not always that clean because it with property acquisition, it can be pretty murky. But the first side that we would like to think is that the physical or intrinsic factors. And I think so it's a significant recreation access property, i.e. it's near something of great significance. It's oceanfront property. It's at a really unique lake like Wallowa Lake or a large river system like the Deschutes, all those things. Or conversely, it might be statewide significant natural, cultural resource property, or it could be a statewide historic asset property like a lighthouse. The last factor that I listed on there was that it was a targeted recreation need. And so this is where I think there's a lot of ability to especially for the commission to weigh in, which is, this is where we say, boy, we think the focus should be in this area doesn't have recreation access. This area needs more recreation development. This area has a large population or is in the midst of several underserved communities, and there is no camping or state park presence. So this one is really where I think a factor that could play into that as far as for us to go forward of how we weight these things, because the criteria for us, and it's like, at least I've been pretty blatant, I don't like the score sheets because I don't think it's that clean. It's more of I keep describing it as a red, yellow, green type thing. We want things that are in the green, like it's a good idea, not necessarily that's an 8 as opposed to a 7, because that's not super practical in the real world. So after those factors are evaluated and then the property moves forward, then it gets to the business factors, because realistically we are on a budget and we have to manage and so we have to look at what are the business factors of, is there revenue generation potential or not? Is there visitor utilization? Not necessarily that we're near a population base, but is it going to get used? It isn't necessarily in our best interest to build a property that is only going to have 10 visitors a year if there's other places that have a larger demand. And then finally, what I think is probably one of the biggest factors, and where I kind of talk about opportunity a lot, is the political factors, which is the property actually for sale or has a willing seller? And because if it doesn't, there's a lot of properties we've been ogling for decades, but we don't have a willing seller. Do we have local support from our local government, the county government, the city government, our local government partners that we should acquire it? And finally, is there local community support? This is the real squishy factor, because there's a little bit of it's subjective. These are very subjective calls, generally made by staff, that we say, we really think now's the time to make this move because of our relationships. We've talked to these folks, we've talked to these folks, but it's not a black and white decision. It's our best, I'd say, best educated guess, but oftentimes it's our gut check of, we think this is an opportunity we have now and we may never have again. And it was interesting. We were in Tillamook yesterday, and Commissioner Scar, the North Coast, her and I had a sidebar conversation about development and acquisition, and she used this exact term, and it was funny because I said, well, we're talking to our commission just tomorrow about opportunity, and she said, well, that's the thing you never can figure out. It's always kind of a gut decision, is now's our opportunity and we may never get it again. And so this is the one that I think is probably one of the most important, but it's also the hardest to define, because we're trying to balance those things. And from us, that's what you're going to get is an honest depth check of like where we think, yes, we think this is the time, or it's not the time. And because in all honesty, we get petitioned a lot to acquire property, or that people think it's a good idea, but it may not be. So these are our kind of the three main kind of bubble factors that we're talking about, and that we as we wrap up, this is kind of where the stuff where we'll turn it back over to you all is, do you have weight you want to put on any of these factors, or that you think are a better focus for us? Because I think that's that's where we're at or where we're headed. So I think that's all I had in my session. So turn over to Matt to kind of.
So as you guys are transitioning over, so these two immediately said, oh, Cougar Valley, which was, as we were planning, we were like, the two best to talk about are Cougar Valley, but also recognizing that not everybody understands what that means. And so, back when I sat in Daniel's role and Tim was the director, we were, very politically, locally pressured to make a purchase in the Tillamook Valley, which was the Cougar Valley property.
Don't go away, Jay.
No, he's not. So, so
leaving.
Matt needs to get the technology set up and I'm giving him some space here to
Give it
not
some feedback.
stress. So we were politically positioned and pressured to purchase this property and we purchased the property, which is literally right there on the river. It's a beautiful, beautiful spot. And, Nehalem, it's on the Nehalem. It would be part of the Salmonberry
It's
Trail.
actually Right next to Salmonberry.
It's
Trail.
right next to the Salmonberry corridor. And so we made the purchase, but what happened was the second that Tim made the purchase, he signed a 10-year moratorium that he would never develop the damn property. And and it got very political that we needed to buy this property. We needed to do
There's a
something
request of
quickly.
Local government.
And a very loud senator at the time.
Yeah.
So we made the purchase. He signed the moratorium. I came in as the interim director in 2013. And it wasn't Matt and I, it was, who was it with me? Dennis or John Allen? We went to the mayor's house and they served me. They were, I think it was John Allen. I think it was John Allen. So we sat down at the mayor of Manzanita's kitchen table and he gave me a nice cup of coffee, brought his little puppy for me to pet, and all of a sudden said, oh, by the way, here, I need you to sign this. And it was another 10-year moratorium that I would do nothing to develop that property, but yet the locals could go and fish and do what they wanted to do, but you can never create access or develop that property. And I said, well, I refuse to, and then we'll sell the property then. We're not gonna, this is ridiculous. The agency put, millions of dollars into this and it's now just gonna sit there and no, we're not gonna sign a moratorium. So we did a tour with, I think there were 7 of the city mayors, and even Shirley at the time finally said, we got to develop this. You got to be able to do something different. So, okay, we move fast forward. We're going to get there. We get there with Tillamook County. They say, yep. All the county commissioners look me in the eye individually. Yep, we're ready to go. We get drug into a meeting and you were still at the coast at the time. We get drug into a meeting and they denied our ability to move forward and do anything with that property yet one more time. We're at a meeting yesterday and a new commissioner says, well, why haven't you guys developed Cougar Valley? And I'm just like, the timing must be right. So it only takes, 15 years and it just shows you it's very similar with Brian Booth. I mean, there was a lot of political local pressure to make that acquisition and a commitment to develop it, but the master planning takes years. And by the time that we get to the place that we're developing, new neighbors move in, new commissioners come on board, the world changes. And then all of a sudden we know what we told you to do, or maybe we told you to do that, but don't now. Right. So we have various properties throughout the system that has, every director could tell you another story of a similar issue. So getting the moon and the stars to line up with the rest of the universe to be able to actually do those things is neat. So we really are trying to get that criteria to be more in those bubbles and be cognizant that even though it might be the right thing and the right property and the right place, without the right relationship and the right time, it's going to be near impossible. So we just need to think about those things because they're real. And we've got a lot of money invested in places that we had big high hopes for that didn't happen.
Are we moving forward on Cougar Valley?
So I say we show up at a county commission meeting in the very near future and
We've got.
We're discussing our options. How that might.
Yeah, it's complex. There's a rich tradition of redneck recreation out there.
Right.
And then kind of an interesting question of how that transitions into,
maybe it's the first segment of the Sandberg Trail
maybe so.
with
Yeah,
some good
that's
whack
what it
camping.
becomes. Yeah.
It's
Fascinating.
quite a
Well,
piece of property for sure.
It's
It's
beautiful.
amazing. Okay, so I'm going to build a little bit on what Tabitha shared and JR and just kind of give a current update of where we're at and what our priorities have been kind of up to this point, which a lot of those I think you all will be familiar with because you approved a lot of these acquisitions that I'll kind of run through. I wanted to touch a little bit on those three factors that JR was just talking about and give some examples, that physical and intrinsic factor. And JR kind of alluded to this. We often get approached by a landowner that has a piece of property that really means a lot to them. And it might be a pretty cool piece of property, but it doesn't always rise to that kind of level of statewide, or what we think of as becoming an Oregon State Park. Within the last year or so, I think we were asked to go look at a piece of property up the Burnt River Canyon. And it was a cool piece of property. It was right on the river, had a little farmhouse and some pasture along the river. But truly, when you think about what kind of constitutes an Oregon State Park, it just didn't rise to that level. And we get those a lot. That's just one example. In terms of kind of that political factor, I think we all know if we don't have that local government or local community support, this Cougar Valley is kind of what happens. Or we might have that support going into, but it changes mid-stride. That's a really tough one. And then thinking about that business factor, another thing, and I guess that Burnt River Canyon property fell into this category too, but we do have to be aware, I think, of when a piece of property comes to our attention, is it a 4-hour round trip to go that we would be putting in to go clean a restroom or collect from 5 campsites? I think those are things that we do have to think about as we're looking at these properties. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time for this next slide because I thought it would show up better. It's bad. But these are the acquisition criteria that were developed in that 2013-15 timeframe. It actually is, as you could see, if it was larger, it did go to exec session. And I think these are what we use right now, really, to evaluate and use as criteria as we're looking at properties. And I'll read these since
We can read.
although it's kind of
It's a lot of.
one of the things that I really appreciate about this too, Cami said this the other day, is for each of these criteria. That's laser pointer. You can see there's these reference numbers, and those reference down to the ORSs, to policy, and then also at the time, what was the draft park system plan. So they're really, they're based on content that have been developed through statute, through policy, and then through that plan. So where does that leave us now? What we've been focused on, I think, like we've talked about, is filling in gaps at some of our properties, adding on to properties, solving issues that we might have at some of our properties. That really has been the focus. And I just wanted to talk through a couple of those. This is at Smith Rock. This was, I think, in 2019. There was an almost 38-acre parcel added kind of on the east side of the park. It straddles, I think, both sides of the Crooked River, adjacent to the park. And really, even though this is an addition, it's not kind of a new park. To me, it hits a lot of those criteria in terms of mission, impact, enhancing existing areas, all of those factors. It really hits a lot of those. Another example, this is one that you all approved a couple of years ago. I think this was in 2020. This was almost 28 acres on the west side of Wallowa Lake, what we call the Kent property. And this was to solve a problem. It does add acreage to the parks, or to Wallowa Lake State Park, but really it was to address a problem with emergency ingress and egress and our ability to connect to the county road system there on the west side of the lake. And then our most recent was the addition of the 3 acres next to Kam Wah Chung, or surrounding Kam Wah Chung, that we purchased from the city of John Day. This had been in the master plan. Yes, I'm so excited about this one. This had been in the master plan. Kind of as a side note, there were other properties that were a priority in that master plan, but fortunately someone had the foresight to identify this as a potential piece of property, and so we were able to get it through that. So those are just 3 examples of really what our focus has been over the last several years. I want to pull up two. I'm going to stop sharing this one for just a second and share a different document. So this is a list Tabitha put together of our acquisitions over the last 5 years. You can see the ones that were sales that we acquired, through lottery funding, or that were there's some transfers, there's some easements, donations, gifts, things like that. But the one thing I want to point out, and again, this is where we're wanting guidance for the future. All of these, I think every single one of these was an addition to an existing piece of property. And so, it's a total of 355 acres. And again, I just wanted to share that as well. I'm going to go back to the
Look at what you
That was from watching you all. So I know Tabitha touched on this a little bit, JR did too, and we talked kind of briefly about it, but really a couple of the main reasons I think that we haven't looked at some of the larger standalone type properties. One is I think coming out of the Park a Year program, but another is being able to balance our staffing and our funding to appropriately manage another piece of property. I think our agency has pretty high standards for how we manage a property, and so I think we've been really careful about looking at new properties. Another reason I want to maybe go through this and talk about a couple of different things. This is a map, and again, I apologize for the quality. Our GIS section put this together for me, and this is a map of undeveloped properties across the state. There's actually a couple on here around Lake Hawaii that should be on here, but I think it's tied to a state natural area, so it wasn't on here. But a couple of examples. So there's Cougar Valley up there. That's a 350 acre piece of property that we have. That at some point, whether it's now or whether it's in 10 years, that I think we're going to be able to develop. Kind of on the opposite corner of the state, Crooked Creek State Park is 564 acres. That was purchased specifically to build a campground at some point. We've got others anywhere from, I've got on my notes, 10 to 1,400 areas. Some of them are going to have deed restrictions on this list for sure, but I know some, again, like Cougar Valley, Crooked Creek, some of these others don't have restrictions on how we can use those properties. So we do have quite a bit of undeveloped property. So that's one of the other main reasons that I think we haven't looked at some of the standalone properties. And the other is we do have, we talked about this at Fort Stevens a little bit today. We do have several properties that are what I would probably consider underdeveloped. This is from the master plan for Nehalem Bay State Park. Here you can, the original master plan, I didn't even think to put that picture in, but you can see these 6 campground loops here. The original master plan at Nehalem actually had an additional 6 loops to create a total of 12 loops at Nehalem Bay State Park. The newest master plan has an expansion of a group camp here, a cabin loop up here, a yurt village. And so the point I'm trying to make is we do have other properties that are existing that do already have some development that could definitely stand more and have gone through that master planning process. South Beach is another one that comes to mind. We were down at South Beach last week. I'm not as familiar with that park as JR is, but laid out a very similar detail in terms of what we could potentially develop down there. So with that, one of the things we talked about earlier is, and JR mentioned this, I think Tabitha talked a little bit about it too, is this is where we need guidance. Do we kind of keep down the track that we've been going on, or does there need to be a shift? And if so, kind of what does that look like, or at least what does that discussion look like? We don't have to answer that right now because I'm going to pass it to Cammie to make sure that we get it all in the time that we have allotted.
Yes,
Yeah.
please stand. If you need to stand.
Cammy.
Everybody stand. Yes.
But if you need to stand, thank you. And such a pleasure. You know, the last time I saw you was March of 2019. And I never thought I'd be sitting before you again. So it's a real pleasure. And I realized also that each one of you was on the commission at that time. And the last time that I think we brought the watch list to you was in 2018, in September of 2018. And so much has happened since then. But I wanted to remind you that in fact, excuse me, talking with harder than I thought. I started working for State Parks in 2012. And when I came on, there was the watch list. And it was something that we dusted off. And the watch list, the purpose of it is to list properties that are thought to be suitable for addition to the state park system, but for some reason they are not on the front burner. And we're showing you some of those reasons. It could be we don't have a willing seller, but perhaps the next landowner will, or there will be a change in their status. Maybe the seller doesn't want to sell now, but they want us to come back in 5 years. The property maybe hasn't been fully vetted. We think we want it. It's appealing to us, but we've got to look into it in deeper detail. Political sensitivity, you're all familiar with that one. Target for future exchange. So it's on the list, but it's not yet again on the front burner. Or we have limited funding, and this is a lesser priority. And that is quite often the case. In addition to the watch list, we also used to have sort of, here's our priorities for this biennium. And so we had an active list that we associated with the budget for each biennium. And I think that unfortunately, with COVID, we got down to one person in the property unit. And that person, of course, hadn't had the luxury of being with the department for years and having, watched this unfold over time. So now what we'd like to do is bring this list back to you, this watch list, in executive session, because it is confidential. So we're going to have to set aside some time for it so that we can show you slides. It's a long list that we'll revisit it. We had ranked things high, medium, low. And I want to share that with you at the next meeting and show you which of those have been acquired. So we'll bring that up. We'll show you the ones that were the latest sort of opportunities. I can tell you that one of those had to do with Ecola. And I think that's the very last property that was added to the watch list. So process-wise, we would like to brief you on this in more detail, thinking about next steps with this whole conversation. And in terms of what we hear from you, that's going to inform the watch list as well. And it's not something that will be done in one meeting or two meetings, but we'll get it done, and help get things back process-wise in terms of what do you want us focusing on, what should be high on that watch list. And sometimes we end up picking up something that's a medium or a low priority because of opportunity. And there's good reason for that, as you all know. But we did just want to share with you that we recognize that we have some process in place that we can dust off, that it really engages the commission because you have that conversation among yourselves about, what properties do you want us to be more focused on? So I think it's next steps really, or the conversation, for you to have.
That's a lot of
Yeah.
information. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good.
And it's so simple.
But I think it
If
was.
we could go back to Boardman days.
I forget the percentage you use of like, only this much of it is science, and it was a very, very small percentage of property acquisition. It's a complex process, it really is.
I just want to say, I really appreciate the context that you guys have provided, you know, the history, the you know, eras, and just, you know, the recognition of all of the intersecting pressures and values and priorities and things like that. So I mean, I just think this is super helpful rather than just sort of having sat us down and say, okay, let's talk about property.
Well, and the other piece we'd really like
It sort
to.
of puts it in a different sense of time too, right? You know, I mean, just to.
And that incorporation of like, we do the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan, we do local government grants. We've been having lots of dialogues with the local park providers to have conversations about who should and could and would better manage property, right? So this isn't necessarily about just state parks, like what should be our focus, and then where are we contributing within a community? Because to most users, a park is a park, recreation is recreation. And I know there are different levels of service, but to that point, I don't know that it's buying a whole bunch of new state parks on any part of the state. It's how do we contribute better to the greater recreational needs for the state of Oregon? And if the counties are in a better position because they are eligible for LWCF and they're eligible for the local government grant program that's going from 12 to 25% of that constitutionally dedicated funding. I just have to keep saying that loud to get myself used to it. If that's the case, right, like we need to be thinking that way. Like in many places, the county is actually a better recreation provider than the state of Oregon. And vice versa. And we're very candid in those conversations, and we weren't before. It was these are state parks, these are county parks, these are special district parks, and you know, Cascadia is being run probably better than we had run it. And same thing with Jackson County. I mean, there are opportunities for us to think more in that greater comprehensive conversation. And so it may even be a larger dialogue with the recreation map with all of those things incorporated, so you can better see where there is recreation, because there are places, I would argue, in every part of the state that are underutilized because they're held by a federal government who doesn't have an emphasis on recreation. And maybe the conversation as we enter into IGAs. Most people don't understand that Detroit State Park is not a state park. I mean, it's a state park, it's managed by us, but we've been managing it for how many years? 30, 40? Are my numbers close?
Yeah.
But it's
60. Yeah.
since the early 60s, at least 66, I think, for sure. And it's not a state park. And the users have no idea that Detroit Lake State Park is not a state park. I mean, it's not ours. We don't own it.
I would tell you.
It is a state park, but we don't own it.
But I mean, but when we get into the acquisition isn't necessarily the priority. It's the recreation. That's the priority. And I think that's the part to me that's been lost when you go through the history, is it's greater than it was when it was Boardman creating preservation and conservation.
You have a model for where we can be most helpful here, and you hit on it. Kiwanda has been transformed because
We helped.
you helped facilitate the county, but there was a huge problem. And the problem hasn't gone away. It's still overused, but it's manageable. Where before it was just chaos, dangerous chaos.
Right.
And I'm well aware of the work that happened there, and there's other places in the state. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be front and center on, just not managing our parks, but managing recreation intelligently as partnerships.
So my comments and questions aren't real short, but indulge me a minute or two. That where you just got and talking about collaboration is where I think our solution is. I care less about acquisition, but perhaps for the manager of a park that's on federal ground, maybe that's the model in the future. I don't know, but if we don't go towards collaboration, we're never going to get local buy-in. I laugh sometimes listening to this agency talk about county government and think, boy, you guys don't understand. And when you've seen one county in Oregon, you've seen one county. And you can't ever forget it. And elections are part of our reality. That said, last Tuesday had a dramatic impact on what will always be in the back of my mind in this crazy move to the state of Greater Idaho. And while it may never happen, it's in a whole bunch of people's mind in Eastern Oregon. And we got to figure out a way, and this is one agency that I think is one of the most proactive, and I'm proud to be a part of it, that has an opportunity to partner and collaborate in the middle of it. I talk about 355 acres of new ground, and I think about 75% of 6.5 million acres in Harney County being all public lands. And so 355 doesn't sound like very much. I gotta hit on one thing that just irritates me at the end of the day, and you've all heard me say it before. I pick up a 2022 Oregon Parks and Rec pamphlet, and Harney and Malheur County are covered by the legend. And that's the second time I've said this here, and it's those little pinpricks eventually will bleed you to death. And it wasn't me that picked it up, it was somebody handing it to me and saying, how come? And I don't have an answer for it. The comment of 4 hours round trip, if that's the cutoff, we're done in Eastern Oregon. Completely, totally done. Every time I go to Three Forks on the Owyhee, I stop at the BLM yard at Rome and pick up toilet paper and take it down and put it in myself. And there are creative ways to take care of those solutions, and we got to think about them. And that's where I go back to the collaboration as we move forward. The watch list is also interesting. At what point does this commission have input to what's on the watch list? And again, acquisition means something different to me than just buying it. If we can collaborate and work through that, I drive past a historic water wheel on the Owyhee and see it 3 or 4 times every year, and it's going away. And I'm trying to figure out a way to fix it, and I bet it's $1 million fix. And
Everything is these days.
it's by the same token, I hate to see it go away. And then watch us put tons of money into lots of projects. Every one of them is impossible or is important, and we ought to keep after them. But I guess I want to, as we do this conversation, I really want to be proactive and would like to see this commission be proactive in helping set whatever that is and where we're going and how we're going to do it, because there is an opportunity out there. And if part of that ends up undermining some of the let's go be part of Idaho argument, it'd make my day as we do it. So anyway, there's me whining for those meetings.
Well, to your point, Commissioner Grassi, I think the commission has ultimate say over what's on that watch list. Maybe not individual commissioners, but I think as a commission, you could say with this specific property or that those ones could be high versus low. As a group, that's, that was actually part of the historical context, right? Is there are people that have the ability to tell direct staff what our priorities are.
You're
The
one of them.
commission is that group, that most direct group. The legislature has some pull, the governor has some pull, this commission has a direct pull if on directives, if the group so says, that's where we pursue. And I personally, I don't know that I'd go as far as say, we always welcome that guidance, because we might be like, oh man, that's a long ways out there, but we're gonna do it, like we're all parkies. It's actually pretty easy. So Matt referenced this property on the Burt River. It took about a half a second for him and I to be like, yeah, we're going to drive out there and go look at it. Like we were all for it, like to go, we're park people. We love to look at potential parkland and we'll brainstorm. Lisa laughs because if Matt and I are in the car, she'll get a call within an hour and we've laid out like, but we can do this and this and this and this and this.
No.
So we're actually usually a pretty easy sell, but so that guidance all joking aside, is welcome. Like, we're always willing to look at that. It's barring that guidance. Here's what we're doing, right? There is a method to our madness of where we're pursuing what we think is our criteria, and sometimes that maybe is based in what we would consider practicality, which is budget is a real thing. So we're going to look at just what we shared at Fort Stevens. If I can add 50 tent sites here, it's better than buying property just down the road and building it new. That's not the same as saying it's the same as buying in Eastern Oregon, because those are two different things. But we know on the coast, we're always looking for more capacity. A lot of our local elected county officials are saying we need more capacity. You need to look at that here. And so we go, okay, well, for us, that answer is it's a lot easier to build another loop at South Beach than it is to buy a whole new property and build a whole new property.
So when you're thinking through those kind of arguments, and do you ever do a market analysis? And let me tell you why I'm asking that question. If you think about one of my pet projects at Birch Creek on the Owyhee, if you're sitting in Salem or Portland and ask that question, you're going, no freaking way is there a market. You're sitting in Boise, Idaho, and looking at it. All of a sudden, you are, and there's a whole bunch of economics that can be driven that you won't get in the analysis if you do a marketing analysis on Oregon. And so are you thinking about that when you're on the border of California?
Oh yeah, because we've been championing for a long time. Sucker Creek, Lake Owyhee. We have undeveloped property at Lonesome Willow. That was one that reference that was on our map.
I want to develop before I'm done.
We have a pretty nice parcel of ground called Lonesome Willow that abuts Sucker Creek and Lake Owyhee that has an opportunity and is really in the back door of Boise. And so yes. Having said that, even Lake Owyhee doesn't run that full of capacity. So, it is, yes, it's utilized and that utilization has increased. So we have to look forward. It's still different, right? Like the usage is still different, like as far as how much usage you get, but those properties, so yes, I do think we try and at least take that in. Lonesome Willow, again, at least I drove her down there right early on in my tenure as region manager and say, let me show you a piece of property that we own.
It's still not developed.
That we could do something with.
So help me, man, what property you got?
It's on the way to Sucker Creek.
So it's abutted to the north end of Sucker Creek.
Yeah, it's a former ranch property we acquired. I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe.
Oh gosh.
Fairwell Bend in 2007.
I want to say 2005, 2006. Yeah. And so in the other part, Commissioner Grassi, is so two of my executives that are sitting on the team right now, one lives in the Grand, one lives in Joseph. They both have actually been stationed around the state. They have experience in each one of the regions and several of the districts. So they both have had a lot of time on the coast and they both had a lot of time in the east. And so balancing that has been really important to me sitting in the seat to make sure that those perspectives are there, because I love Dennis Comfort to death, but every time I ask Dennis about everything, it's the coast, the coast, the coast, the coast, the coast, right? Which is what you're going to do and what you're going to do. And this balances us a little bit more. It is so fun to watch them go. Susan isn't as there yet. She'll get into the arm wrestle, but when and Ross is always Silver Falls, but it is more, it is so not Salem centric. And I just want to make sure that, that we have made that conscious effort to make sure that we have staff represented from all around. And I'd say this to our local electeds and our community partners all the time. And it was very obvious in COVID and the fires, but our staff live in those communities. Our staff are those communities. It's not like we just ride people from Portland to Salem to work in these parks. The people that are working at Fort Stevens that you saw today, they are part of that community. You could see when Mike left and tried something different, he needed to come home. Like this is his thing, right? So we are very well represented around the state and in a great position to do what you're talking about, which is partner and collaborate and coordinate with those county and federal and all those other partners, because it's all about the relationships. And so over there to have a conversation to say, who is the best manager? We shouldn't have had to be in a spot where we have a declaration of cooperation from 2000, whatever year that was, 11, maybe 12, I don't know, where we were legislatively directed through an Oregon Solutions project to go work with our local partners. It's like, you shouldn't have to tell us to do that. That's something we should just be doing. So there's a lot more focus on trying to figure out how to do that. And acquisition is a tool, but it's not just acquisition. It's,
Well, I'm not arguing against that point, but I'm just one statement saying no.
yeah.
I said 18 years of the administrator of Harney County.
Yep.
I never, ever had a state parks employee come and see me. Call them, yeah, and come.
Mhm.
Never, ever.
Yeah.
So, Beth, I didn't know you when you were there.
But
I've spent a lot of time with Judge Wallace. In fact, we were talking about doing just what you were describing, that kind of cooperative approach to managing property down there, because we have Frenchman Hotel and the corrals. And we were hoping to at some point to get Fish Lake there in the seams. And I know that the county is looking at some recreation property too, and so we were trying to figure out a way, how could we split positions? So we get a full-time
And we're not
position in the
making
county,
decisions.
benefit position. We may have, they may have, we don't know, we didn't quite get to that point, but now I know he's not even being reelected, so. I don't know where those conversations will go, but just so you know, we were trying. We were getting pretty close.
Good.
And the other thing I was gonna mention that Lisa's brought up a couple of times lately, but it has really kind of struck me. And that is, Lisa will articulate this way better than I can, but the idea is that when we hand off this system to the next generation, like, we've got to leave it better than we found it. It's got to function, it's got to sustain itself. And so that's one of my worries about expanding too much and spreading it too thin, is that what are we going to hand that next generation of Oregonians and park owners?
One thing sorry.
So I gotta say, it's part of what I think this department, we've got to struggle with a little bit. When I go out and look at Harney out here, county in particular, people aren't overly interested in going to a camp.
Right.
So what's the role of Oregon Parks and Rec with dispersed recreation? And, 500 people on one weekend on the outdoor desert, are you kidding me? I mean, and not people.
Vehicle.
Probably
Probably like 3,000 people.
And where's our role? And to be a little bit greedy, can we make some money doing it? And at least generate revenue. And I don't know, but maybe there's a model there that we need to figure out as we go into the future.
What I was thinking was going back to you've seen one county, you've seen one county. and like what you were saying, Lisa, about, the embeddedness of staff in the communities, to me, is one of the richnesses here, so it's like, there's not a one size fits all. Here's the set of criteria. Here's what you use, right?
Even in the same.
Because of all those things, right? And so one thing that I'm just sort of thinking is, you have something like a watch list about properties that you might want to acquire. And is there also something, and maybe it's region by region, that's almost like an opportunity map of what you said? Like, where are the recreational opportunities, not for parks to manage necessarily, but where are, and I know the SCORE probably has some of this, right? So I feel like there are a whole bunch of documents out there, but from the standpoint of looking at a place and thinking about the overlays, like I'm thinking GIS, where you say, here's a region, here are places where potentially there's a partnership, like what you just said, Matt, like maybe there's a partnership with the county because there's an opportunity to have a staff person who can help manage things. It's not about acquisition, but in other regions, it might be a different colored map. And it's not, again, I'm not talking just acquisition map, it's an opportunity map of saying, where's our role as an agency? So I was also thinking about your history thing and the different phases. And, it's not a park system map, it's a park agency strategy, which says, what are the different roles we play? We play a lot of different roles, probably too many. Well, given all the roles we play, how do those roles show up here? in what different ways? How do those different roles show up here, right? So that it's a, and I think speaking as someone who doesn't live it on a daily basis, like all you guys do, it's harder for me to always see those intersections. But it could be helpful potentially to sort of even help others see where those intersections are and say, we're not showing up to buy something, we're not showing up to own anything or manage, but we're showing up to be a partner and thinking about
How do we
these things, because we play this role and this role and this one.
So I think there's a lot to that and while I think we do it, I don't know that it's always like so directly
Right.
overlaid, you
Right,
know,
right, right.
because the answer is depending on, so much depends on
It's
the local
overlaid,
leadership
yeah.
at the time.
Right.
There's
It's the
times where we
relationship.
wanted to acquire property in
Right.
counties that the answer was,
No way.
no, thanks. We don't want you here. And so we moved on, but I know, being on the east side, when I was a region manager, we talked about that a lot. I talked to Michelle about that on grants. I felt like I pitched grants all the time. I spent the day in Mitchell.
Is the grant.
We have no properties in that county, but I spent the day in Mitchell with the local leadership, the mayor, who's also the bus driver, who's also the pastor, talking about community grant programs and ways parks could offer technical assistance, even though saying, hey, we're a partner, even if we don't own property here, because we're a statewide agency that support outdoor rec, and it was myself and governor's regional solutions team member just meeting with kind of the town leadership, and they were super appreciative of that. So I do think there's a role, even if we're not necessarily I don't think we have the ego that we need to be the headliner, right? Our goal is to support outdoor recreation, and if it's technical assistance or support or grants.
And if the grant
all of
thing
those do it.
flips, right, we
Right.
hit that ratio thing and boom, well, so even more so, it's like,
Right.
great.
We don't
So
need to
we'll
own
give, you know,
more.
technical assistance, do you want some wisdom here, what makes sense, you know?
Well, and sometimes it's that like starting at the cooler side, going
Yeah.
towards the warmer
Right.
side. So I grew up in Eastern Oregon and there isn't always a lot of trust towards government entities. So sometimes showing some of those, I've written grants for some of our small communities to help them, trying to show how easy it is. Like these are good programs. There's not a trick. There's, but there is some distrust at times in those areas. And so but being present, I think is the answer that I think we're seeking and trying to really push our management team that's a part of it is being there and offering and saying just because we don't own property right there doesn't mean we still don't have a role we could play.
So who's been to Alaska and driven to Alaska in the last year?
Last year.
Driven.
So
I've been driven.
what's the name of the book that you always have with you when you're driving up and tells you where everything is?
Atlas.
Nope. No, there's a book just on driving from
Oh.
the US to, geez, anyway. As I drove over here yesterday, I kept thinking, I wish I had that book for Oregon. And I don't think it's something that Oregon Parks ought to do, but I think it's something Oregon Parks ought to encourage to get done. Because I drive all these parks, and Lisa, you said it earlier.
Where the 10
Nobody
places.
cares who the park, whether it's state or county. or
Where should I
city
stop? What should I
or
see?
even in
Yep.
many cases, it's private. It just, I need a place to park my RV tonight,
Yeah.
and where can I go? And if we can encourage that, those kind of
All
things, I think
lamps.
it's gonna help dramatic.
So to your point, so this is a recent thing. It's like not out in the world yet, but our communication and IT division have been working on some GIS work. So there used to be this thing that I've referenced forever that was awesome, which was a fold out map, and it was a recreation map. And it was
amazing.
I think ODOT put it out,
It was
but it
ODOT.
had everybody. It had county parks, federal parks, state
Yeah.
parks, and just a state of Oregon recreation map. And they stopped printing it in probably early 90s. I've got an old one somewhere, and we have said, several of us have said we should redo that, but our communication and GIS folks are like this close to having a public interface overlay that we can get on the website
There's an app
where
for
you
that.
can actually pick up and look at all recreation, not just like us, but everybody's. And it's like they showed us briefly the other day how they're working on it and the potential. If we can get it fine tuned and out there, it's amazing.
You need an app.
Yeah.
There's an
It's
app.
amazing. But I think that's exactly the role we can play, is to
TikTok
convene
video
that
that
kind of
goes-
a format. Yeah.
I'm gonna throw out one more quick example of kind of that Town Richmond partnership. And it has to do with acquisition too. we're working and have been for a couple of years and COVID slowed it way down with ODFW to swap them some property that they can better manage because it's habitat for some of their property, which is small campgrounds down the confluence of the Wenatchee and the Grand Island. And in that, BLM has already said that they'll help staff some of that. There's a takeout there for the, for Raft Rental out in the Grand Island. ODFW already has a big shop and a compound down there, so they'd be able to help staff some of that. We could staff it. So those opportunities are definitely out there, and I think maybe we don't talk about them enough, but they're definitely happening.
And
For
that's
sure.
it, I think, because we shifted that a couple of years ago and really tried to get our park managers, or district managers, or region managers to understand that those relationships have to be formed because the trust will come there. If the three of us show up in a county, it probably isn't going to mean as much as if Justin and Mike show up and have a conversation with their local partners, right? And that trust is there because the relationships are there. And we've come a long way in the last 5 years. And in some ways COVID slowed it down, but in some ways COVID accelerated it because it allowed us to be more in sync with the opening and closing and then the fire coordination. So the time is right. And the direction may be more like, so here's a watch list, right? And the watch list is gonna have things that are gonna inform like, are there any ocean shore properties we don't currently own? Those need to stay on a watch list because we kind of should have those properties, right? Or there may be things that seem iconic enough we want on there, but at the same time, that direction needs to be more focused on pushing the agency to think about how do we manage the recreation needs for the state, and that could be through collaborations, that could be through management of that, it could be an IGA, it could be whatever that looks like, and pushing more on that relational piece rather than the transactional. In my brain is how it works, because the more that I'm in community with folks and recognize what the needs are, it's like, well, hey, if you take it, you could go work with Michelle and their team, and they do an incredible job of providing technical support to the smaller communities to help them write those grants and get them to places. And, today we're out there, Chrissy's like, well, hey, what if we got the garden house, which to me, you all thought it looked great today. I was in there like 5 or 6 years ago. It's horrendous how much it is degraded.
Yeah.
Because we haven't cared for it. Nothing's going that ceiling and losing that other side. I mean, it looks.
Which location?
The guardhouse we were in there today. And so, and you think about an entire system, how many of those historic and special places we have that talk about $1 million price tag. And it used to be you could walk out of Costco with $100. Now everything we touch in parks is $1 million project. And we got a lot of them. And Chrissy's like, well, what if we get it on the not endangered species? If we get it on this, then it'll be eligible for grants. But it's that kind of thinking that we need to be doing. So we'll bring you back the watch list, and so that way you know what's on it. We'll talk about that there, but that policy direction, I don't think it's a go acquire a whole bunch of new parklands, because I don't know what the system is lacking. It'd be different if it doesn't have a hot spring or it needs whatever. There's not a lot of that. It's what are those greater needs, and really push to me the organization to be more collaborative around power managing and recreation, kind of more at a bigger picture level.
I look forward to the return of the watch list. I enjoyed the watch list in the past and seeing how it articulated sort of the underlying values and vision behind that. I think that was always very helpful. And again, it implied kind of regional strategies within the state, which I always think was helpful. And I think I look forward to having that conversation. I know we're going to talk about this again in February. I encourage Lisa to give us some homework maybe in terms of thinking about what we're going to say in February about acquisitions and disposal of parklands, because the two, I know we're talking about both, and the values and the criteria are all connected. And so I think that it's a very good opportune time to have that discussion. And I know a couple of quick caveats. I think we probably all want to get going here soon and get on to the hotel and to dinner. But I do think that in assessing these opportunities in front of us, of course, we want to think about the mission broadly. I know that we use the word outdoor recreation as a sort of shorthand for a lot of things we do here. And on one level, that's important because that's a sort of special mission that we have within the state. But simultaneously, our mission statement is very clear that we have this responsibility for natural, scenic, historic, cultural, and recreational lands, and for the education and enjoyment of future generations. And I think that is important to bear in mind. We have those places, especially that allow us to sort of hit several of those where we have a real natural resources value, a cultural resources value that also provides that education and recreational component. We all know this, but I have to admit, as a person who's a big enthusiast of the cultural, historical, natural, and scenic aspects, I get nervous when we use recreational as our constant shorthand for everything. Recreation we know what that is, and we also know that it means many things. And I think we want to be thinking broadly about that in acquisition terms, but also in the question of disposal of lands and also protecting existing assets. As we talked about, there have been ongoing conversations at Ecola about how so much of that is calving off the headland. The Feldenheimer Reserve was created to sort of add protection, and yet there are still some additional steps maybe required. And so those shoring up those longstanding assets is something I think we all agree is really highly significant as beach parks retreat to the east and all that kind of stuff in response to climate change, which wasn't on our radar during some earlier phases of policy development. And so those are all very important considerations. And the good news is I have complete trust in staff because all you guys are really cool. And I don't say that just to pander, though I am pandering too. But I have been impressed at the level of attention to detail all the way through this and thinking about all those variables and really anticipating what the next generation, long after all of us are gone, is going to be looking at and dealing with in the acquisition of those lands. I have a little footnote, though. I do know that the messaging publicly and about how we dispose of park property is going to be very important. I can just say between all of us friends here, I have in the last 3 to 4 months heard more cranky noise about Jackson County and Cascadia and a few others on our list, and even Fort Yamhill. Actually, in fact, I had a slightly cranky calls from somebody about Fort Yamhill in the last week. And so I think that to some extent, on one level, I can say, messaging is important to the outside world to substantiate why are we doing that, and why is that in the best interest of Oregonians that we are developing those kinds of relationships to protect not just again recreation, but cultural, natural, scenic, historic resources.
I think it's such a cool, good point to share with people all that, and while those properties are ultra important, and we have several very important ones. Fort Stevens that we drove through is great. To sound like a greedy capitalist, we only pay for those by building a campground that runs full,
right?
And because and my example I shared for years on this is if we go down to the Central Coast, Beverly Beach unit has 14-day uses associated to that campground that it runs.
Right.
That unit runs even money.
Yeah.
Because it brings in that campground brings in money. It subsidizes 13 or 14 other properties.
Yeah.
So there's this practical side that we do have to balance. We are a business. The park system plan draft.
Yeah.
That was the crux of it, right? Is when you have low revenue and costs are going up, you're going to run into a wall.
Right.
And so we do have to strike that balance. And sometimes it's going to be this like, ooh, this one, if we get rid of this, we can focus these assets. Right. And I actually value our agency that we run business like, not like a business, not just like a business, but we try to work business like it is a balance. And sometimes building that spot in a high visitation, high use area is going to prop up some of those properties that need a lot of money that don't bring in any revenue whatsoever.
Right. Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say, and Tavis is gonna talk more about this next time, and I'm just not gonna keep them secret, but it's kind of amazing if you look at our past disposition, the percentage of properties, it was much greater than it's been over the last 10, 15 years.
Right. So
Sorry.
I was telling my that's more advanced water project for this meeting. And we're going to get real deep in the weeds on this position. But one of the things that I noticed that sort of stood out to me as a pattern, if you don't have a lot of disposition in that whole neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
There's not any. It takes about 500 acres and people leverage instead of something
Some
else
bigger, better.
Right.
Better.
Right.
But the 50 years that follow that have a really consistent sort of for every batch of acres you have coming into the system, you are getting rid of about 25% of that number. So we're 20 and 25%.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
About, the last 20, 30 years, something around that, where we're doing very little.
Right. Right.
So I think part of that perspective, that was been my sort of my perspective too, it's like, I like having apartments.
Yeah. Yeah.
And-
probably the first-
Yeah, yeah.
Or if it's as simple as going to a business perspective, this doesn't make sense for us to plan.
Right.
And you can manage it better, you can manage it, you know, more intelligently, just, you know, regionally, whatever that perspective is. I just found it really interesting to see over 3 or 4 different leaders of the agency that are pretty consistent number, 20 to 25% was
Yeah.
was sort of the difference.
That's
between
interesting.
Acquisition number versus. distribution number.
Yeah, that's good. And it's great to investigate that and maybe bring that forward into the public discourse because, and some of that reflects things like Sam Boardman really overshot a lot of the time. He was grabbing
But hey,
everything.
grab everything you can, you'll be
Yeah.
able to get what you want.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe there were, 20 acres at the core that really of importance, but he got 312 because that was the parcel available. So we had a lot of that. So I agree. And I guess part of what I'm suggesting by talking about the public messaging is that the first step to good public messaging is having a very good internal policy and understanding. Because we don't want just a good message. We actually want to have the policy clarified internally. And to be able to bring that forward, because I do, again, on the disposal of properties issue, I'm hearing enough noise right now that I wouldn't be surprised to see 1 or 2 or 3 nonprofit organizations pick this up as an issue and start to make enough noise that it becomes a bit of a headache. So in some ways, if we want to get ahead of that with some real thoughtful consideration about criteria, and again, the values, the sort of synergies that exist when we have multiple entities partnering on the management of those lands that still advance
Right.
in some material way, the cultural, historic, scenic, natural, recreational values of that place for the state of Oregon. And if we can build that case, then I think we're basically okay there. And that means, all the foundational work that all of you are doing, building up the case as to why that works, why that's it's consistent with the historical realities of the agency. And that we now move forward mindfully and not just sort of making arbitrary decisions. So I think that this is a great conversation to have. I look forward to the homework.
Cami, you
The,
have something? Go sir. I think Cami had something a bit ago. I just want to make sure that you had a chance to.
But yeah, I was just gonna say about process in terms
Yeah.
of real estate staff, it's so helpful to know what it is our targets are. It takes time to acquire property, it takes more time to dispose of. And so, having a clear plan and having the commission on board, with what that next 2 years looks like is really, really helpful. So we're looking forward to being back to that. But this conversation around how we frame up the bigger conversation, we're at our 100 years, new book out. I mean, it's perfect timing really.
For writing
to
history.
frame it.
On to your point, then in February, we could do that, right? Bring the watch list, have that conversation with the hope of April, at least having that draft policy ready for you to go, yay, yeah, warmer, colder. But with that, right? Because we're horrible about telling the story, but at the same time, there has to be a story out there about disposition, because when you start looking at all the property that we own that has never been developed, it's either that is the direction you need to give us, is to go develop that property or find ways to develop that property in partnership, whether it's us or it's a county or somebody else, but that starts getting out there publicly that that's the policy direction you've given us, then your phone calls will be worse, but at least there's a direction, right? Like it's us just doing it. Part of it, we can fall back and say, well, we have a declaration of cooperation that we were legislatively mandated. That's what we keep pointing to, is like, hey, we were directed to do this. Like, this is a legal binding agreement that we have that it doesn't expire. So we're operating under that legislative direction to tell us to partner with our partners.
I just want to say, sorry, I missed most of the conversation.
We'll give you clip notes.
I got to catch up with someone, but just wanted to say, yeah, between now and whenever we kind of have the next round of things off, I'm willing to offer any support or stuff. I'm not sure if you talked to folks from Metro. And so we had a whole process in taking a bond measure that identified acquisition and protection restoration of lands, and really cascading from the federal guidance and then state endangered species guidance, regional conservation strategies, and set it up and to take the metro region into 24 target areas, defining what those target areas were, then bringing that to the voters for approval, and then going back to council to help identify and clarify, like, what are some of the priorities within there, then taking that back out to the public and going through ecological assessments, getting input from the tribes, local indigenous communities, overlaying environmental justice lens, and taking all those different target areas to refine it into a confidential list of tax lots, which was then approved by the council to go forward and let staff act on. That works very differently in a like metropolitan regional area with a defined set of geography and a different thing, but
Like, I'm out.
I know, right? But some of the learnings from that in process of prioritization,
Tax lot what?
it's all Eastmoreland, it's all historic districts. Yeah. But that's published document of the whole refinement plan, but taking that policy, turning it into an actionable plan. And it's something that lasted for 10 years until the voters renewed a second, another bond, and then being able to like refine that one again. So if there's anything that the team from Metro can help with, just how they tackled a big thing with a lot of different voices and tried to put the council in a spot as policymakers to give staff that direction to go and execute on. It helped a lot. And so if there's anything, the team is super strained trying to move all that forward now, but I bet I could carve out if you haven't already, or if it's been a while, just talk to some of those folks, how they went through that process. And happy to take this offline and point you in that direction. But look forward to the rest of these conversations.
Sorry, we went long, but it is probably the single most conversation that we really need or want from all of you, especially those of you that think you're expiring in the next 6 months or so.
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not, I don't know. And that is the other thing, you'll see on your agenda tomorrow, that we had a moment of the governor's office saying that we were going to have nominations move in December. And then it was that's not happening. And then it was maybe because your chair is going off, could go off in March or April. Let's go ahead and move the chair, vice chair and chair now. That way it's done, because it may be months, because with a bunch of new legislators, a new governor, we may or may not be having appointments move forward. It may be some of the bigger agencies, more political, that go, and the lower hanging may not, or the low hanging may go first. So I have no idea, but we're going to take it off the agenda for tomorrow and we'll wait and see what happens, because these two said they'll stay serving. But I did get a little anxious when we're down one, and then all of a sudden I got two that could say, I'm done. Like, oh my gosh, we don't have a quorum. No problem there. So, but the biggest thing that we could do here over the next few months is get this property policy direction set. So any input that you have to help us give you the right amount of homework to be able to get to a place of some policy direction that you can leave us with as you start to depart. So, yeah.
Lisa, can you send us the PowerPoint and the matrix that we just saw, just so we can?
Absolutely. Yep.
I think I'll invite, we have an amazing planner in the agency. Her name's Jen Moore.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, I would invite her to come capture some of this. She'll be able to lay it out for us. In a really.
Yeah. No, she's a rock star.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
So, okay.
I completely support plans, but I gotta say, it's our road in the van with the director, and heard her say this today about the planning. And
You heard it at Fort Stevens, plan from 1974. What?
I can tell you that when I left office, during the time I was in office, about state mandated plans about economic development for Harney County, it took 2 hand trucks to carry it. And I can tell you, nothing in them got implemented.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be asking Jenna to come to do a plan. It would be to listen, to facilitate, to help us get the policy drafted. Yeah. She's just that kind of a listener and thinker and facilitator. And yeah. She reminds me of a Kate Shutt. Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
All right. Hey,
Yep.
thank you guys from all of us. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
All right, so we're heading back to
TBD.
the
To be
hotel,
continued.
and dinner is at 6 o'clock, Denise. So you know your logistics. We're heading to the hotel, and you need to be in the lobby by like 10 to 6, so you can be in vehicles to head to dinner.
Bye, Liz. See you tomorrow.
Bye, Liz.
Hi, guys. Sorry I'm missing you in person, but see you tomorrow.